Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Blair.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan, and thank you, Rusi, for giving me the opportunity to speak to everyone today. It's going to be a relatively short speech to set the scene, and then we'll have the chance for questions and answers. The context of this speech, originally a reflection on the 20 years since 9/11, has dramatically changed as a result of the events of the past 20 days. I will not repeat what I have said about the fact and manner of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I will focus instead on the policy issues raised by it. The Taliban are part of the global movement of radical Islam. The movement contains many different groups, but they share the same basic ideology. In simple terms, this holds that there is only one true faith, only one true view of that faith, and that society, politics, and culture should be governed only by that view. Radical Islam believes not only in Islamism, the turning of the religion into a political doctrine, but in the justification of struggle, if necessary, armed struggle, to achieve it. Other Islamists agree with the ends but eschew violence, but the ideology itself is in inevitable conflict with open, modern, culturally tolerant societies. Nearly everything about 9/11 and its aftermath, particularly now, is mired in controversy. What cannot be seriously disputed, however, is that since 9/11, though thankfully there's been no further terrorist attack of that scale, radical Islam has not declined in force. What is disputed is why. Is radical Islam a coherent ideology which represents a first-order threat to our security? Or are we facing, despite some common themes, a series of disconnected security challenges, each of which require handling on its own terms based on local circumstances? Is Islamism a problem or only its manifestation in violent extremism? Is it akin, as I say, to revolutionary communism and must be countered by a combination of security and ideological measures over the long term? Or is that to overstate it, overestimate it, and thus perversely, as some would argue, by the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, to elevate its appeal rather than diminish its appeal? This is a fundamental strategic question, and it needs a clear answer. In my view, Islamism, both the ideology and the violence, is a first-order security threat, and unchecked, it will come to us, even if centered far from us, as 9/11 demonstrated. The analysis published recently by Dr. El-Badawi from my institute shows how the roots of Islamism stretch back over many decades, grew in strength long before 9/11, and it examines the links between the ideology and the violence. This is supplemented by the excellent analysis of the ulema state concept by Ahmed Kuru and by the annual report we publish of jihadist groups, which shows that this is a global challenge and one that is getting worse. The ideology, whether Shia promulgated by the Islamic Republic of Iran or Sunni promoted by groups on a spectrum from the Muslim Brotherhood through to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram and many others, has been the principal cause of destabilization across the Middle East and beyond, and today in Africa. Like revolutionary communism, it operates in many different arenas and dimensions. And like it, its defeat will come ultimately through confronting both the violence and the ideology by a combination of hard and soft power. Now, if this is a correct analysis, then especially after the fall of Afghanistan, the leading powers must unite to develop an agreed strategy. And even if initial discussions center around Western nations, China and Russia also have an interest in countering this ideology, and our best allies are to be found in the many Muslim countries, including in the Middle East, desperate to retake their religion from extremism. We need also to assess our vulnerability. COVID-19 has taught us about deadly pathogens. Bioterror possibilities may seem like the realm of science fiction, but we would be wise now to prepare for their potential use by non-state actors. On the other hand, if this analysis is rejected, the alternative is, in effect, to say this is a second-order problem. Where we are directly threatened, we retaliate through counter-terrorism measures, drone strikes, surveillance, special forces, but otherwise we leave alone. But if this is where policy is heading, we have to understand it to its limitations. We need to work out what we mean by not remaking countries from which terrorist threats can arise. I understand it means that we do not do what we tried to do in Afghanistan. Though one thing should be understood: our remaking didn't fail because the people didn't want the country remade. For sure, we could have remade better, but Afghans did not choose the Taliban takeover. The last opinion poll in 2019 showed the Taliban with 4% support amongst the Afghan people. They conquered the country by violence, not persuasion. The barrier to nation building is usually not the people, but poor institutional capacity and governance, including corruption, over many years. And most of all, the challenge of trying to build whilst internal elements combined with external support are trying to destroy. But counter-terrorism on its own won't remove an entrenched threat. We could seek a middle course. For example, in the Sahel, we could adopt a strategy of assisting countries with security, but also supporting the government's own attempts to develop their nations, because poverty and underdevelopment undoubtedly facilitate the extremists. In a way, this is what we did in Afghanistan post-2014, when NATO's mission went to train, advise, and assist. But even here, this will likely encompass more than conventional counter-terrorism. We need some boots on the ground. Naturally, our preference is for the boots to be local, but that will not always be possible. Western societies and their political leaders have become, quite understandably, deeply averse to casualties amongst our armed forces. This is not a problem for the armed forces themselves, who are brave and extraordinary people, but it is now an overwhelming political constraint to any commitment to Western boots on the ground except for special forces. Yet the problem this gives rise to is obvious. If the enemy we're fighting knows that the more casualties they inflict, the more our political will erodes, then the incentive structure is plain. There is an additional challenge for Europe and NATO. It is clear now, if it wasn't before, that America has decided that for the foreseeable future, it is a very limited appetite for military engagement. After Kosovo, I initiated European defense with France. I did this precisely because I realized that without the United States, and indeed President Clinton's commitment, we could never have resolved the crisis. And today, the Balkans, relative to its history, can aspire to a peaceful future, hopefully within Europe. Yet the crisis was on Europe's doorstep, not America's. It's Europe that faces the immediate challenge from the destabilization of the Sahel. Europe is already facing the fallout from Libya, Syria, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And for these purposes, Britain is part of Europe, like it or not. So how do Europe and NATO develop the capability to act when America is unwilling? Answering these questions, at least confronting them, would also reinvigorate Western policymakers' capacity to think strategically. For me, one of the most alarming developments of recent times has been the sense that the West has lost its capacity to formulate strategy, that its short-term political imperatives have simply squeezed the space for long-term thinking. It is this sense, more than anything else, in my judgment, which gives our allies anxiety and our opponents a belief that our time is over. Finally, one of the most depressing things I've heard regularly articulated over the past weeks is the idea that we are foolish in believing that Western notions of liberal democracy and freedom are exportable or will ever take root except in the somewhat decadent terrain of Western society. Now, maybe my generation of leaders were naive in thinking countries could be remade, or maybe the remaking needed to last longer. But we should never forget, as we see the women of Afghanistan in the media, culture, and civic society now flee in fear of their lives, that our values are still those which free people choose. Recovering confidence in those values and in their universal application is a necessary part of ensuring we stand up for them and are prepared to defend them. Thank you very much.
Mr. Blair, thank you very much for your presentation. And I should say, for the benefit of journalists or people listening, that both the presentation and the discussion are on the record, so they could be quoted in any shape or form that is required. Mr. Blair, let me just start with a bit that you took as granted, namely your criticism about how we handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan over the last few weeks. You mentioned it at the beginning of your speech by saying, my views are known. You used a rather strong, sometimes one could argue even a bit spicy terminology in terms of criticizing the concept of the forever wars. Unpack it for us. Tell us why do you think that the concept is unhelpful or indeed harmful, as you suggested, to the debate on security questions?
I mean, the term, or the phrase ending forever wars, has been used by politicians of all political stripes, particularly in the United States. And let me say right at the very beginning, I have a deep respect for President Biden. I admire him and like him, and I agree with many of the things that he's trying to do. But not simply those in the Democrat Party, but those in the Republican Party who use this phrase. I think it is a deeply mistaken phrase because, number one, we haven't ended this war. We've ended our participation in it. Different concept. Number two, it's not forever. 20 years, for a lot of the groups we're fighting, 20 years for them is not a long time. And, if you take the revolutionary communism analogy, we stayed with that for 60, 70 years or more. But finally, the rhythm of what we were doing post-2014 and saying by the end of 2019 was obviously completely different from what we were doing in the 2005, 2006, 2007, and in the years after the big problems arose in Afghanistan. So I just think it's not a good way of making policy, because in the end it's a political slogan. It's not really based on an analysis of the threat and the strategy to counter it.
Understood. I have the benefit of talking to you before this event, so in a way I know you're thinking, but I just wonder if you could tell us, I mean, the proposition that is now being put by a lot of people, including the American president, that we should have gone in, smash Al-Qaeda, get bin Laden, which by the way took 10 years, and somehow, and get out, and leave the pieces to the others. Is it something you would have been able to sell to the British public in 2001?
I think it's quite important. I mean, it's a good question, because it's quite important to go back and just relive the events of 9/11. I haven't seen it yet, but I gather there's quite a good documentary done by the BBC about that day and the events and the decisions that were taken, at least by the American president, President Bush at that time. I don't think people would have felt a response that was merely about going and trying to deal with Al-Qaeda and getting back out again. I don't think people would have found that acceptable at the time. I mean, things change, obviously, over time. But in any event, I don't think you can deal with these groups when they're entrenched simply by counter-terrorism measures. I just don't think it's possible. I mean, they hold territory. You know, they build capacity. And the one thing that is very clear about them is that they're prepared to take large numbers of casualties. I mean, in the work my institute does, I mean, when you look even at the years 2017, 2018, you know, and you look around the world, the numbers of people that died at the hands of the extremists is large, but the numbers of extremists themselves who died is even larger. But it hasn't stopped them growing and proliferating, and they will continue to do so. And I think one of the things that's most difficult is for us to get our heads around the elements of this that are to do with genuine religious conviction. Now, it may be completely misguided, but it is a genuine religious belief that has been turned into this political ideology. And the interesting thing about the work that my institute's done, and I really recommend a paper by Dr. Al-Badawi, who works with my institute, on the roots of Islamism, and also the work by Ahmet Kuru on the Ulema State Alliance. What it shows you is this has been, you know, for sure decades in growing, but you can take it back even further. And you realize that there were attempts towards the end of the 19th century to modernize the relationship between Islam and the state, but they failed. And basically, a lot of countries were then increasingly offered, as the 20th century wore on, either secular dictatorship or religious extremism. And then a lot of the opposition to secular dictatorship took the form of Islamism, because it appeared to be the one philosophy that was going to stand up against the dictatorships. And, you know, people again forget this, but when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, it happened and began as an alliance between
the Bazaris.
Yeah, and those that were Islamists and those that were liberals.
Yeah.
And actually exactly the same happened with the Arab Spring. But the problem is, as I always say, the liberals are numerous and badly organized, and the Islamists are quite numerous and extremely well organized. And, you know, what anyone in politics will ever tell you is that superior organization can knock out a superior idea, unfortunately.
So let me take you on this particular subject, if I may, on Islam, which formed a sort of extremism Islam that formed a large chunk of your speech today. I mean, if I was a leader of a country, a European country, I would say, I get your point, and history is on your side in terms of the analysis, but I find your comparison with communism unhelpful because it creates a straitjacket. What do? I've got, I don't know, X percent, 8%, 10% of my population of Muslim faith, citizens, good, dutiful citizens of the country. I can't brand them all as potential sort of fifth columnists. I have to deal with the situation. How do I separate fighting the extremism from accepting the faith?
Yeah, this is, again, a very good point, Jonathan, but it's a very simple one to answer. I mean, probably the majority of Muslims around the world are not Islamists. I mean, there's a difference between being a Muslim and being an Islamist, between Islam and Islamism. Islamism is the turning of the religion into a political ideology. And the problem, if you take any religion, it's not a question of Islam. If you took Christianity and turned it into a, political ideology, let's say of a particular church in a particular part of a church, and say, right, the whole of society and politics and culture is going to be run according to the precepts of this church. I mean, that would be equally bad. And the whole point about Islamism is that because it believes in the dominant one view of religion, of this religion, it's completely at odds with the way the modern world works. The modern world works through people opening up across boundaries of faith and culture. If you're then saying, well, this is the only faith, and this view is the only view of this faith, it's inconsistent with modern societies. Now, there are people, even within our own societies, who support this. And it's a problem, but you're best to confront it. And, the thing that I find strange about this is, out in the Middle East, where I spend a lot of my time, people today have absolutely no problem in distinguishing between the two things. Because they know the single biggest threat to stability in the Middle East is the idea that you're going to create societies based on a narrow view of religious faith, and you're going to ensure that politics, culture, society, economy is governed by it. And so, I think this is a fundamental question, and it's got to be resolved strategically, because I think the other thing that is also very important is that the question I raised at the outset is, I think, the question, is this a first-order threat or a second-order threat? Right? Is it something we need a big agreed strategy of the leading powers to confront? Or is it really a second-order threat? Look, it's not our business unless it comes to our shores. Let's not provoke it by going after it. Counter-terrorism, but that's it. Right. My only point is, if that's where we're going, we should decide it as a matter of strategy. We shouldn't tumble into it because the alternatives or what's happened in Afghanistan simply lead us to that conclusion. It's because it's a big decision. It means that you reposition a lot of your analysis of the world. Now, my view is you can't be sure that it would be unwise to relegate it to being a second-order threat, because I don't see it diminishing in the world at the moment.
But on this point, and then I'll pass on, there is a stalwart of the Foreign Office who would want to ask a question there on the subject. I think it's on the subject. But just to press you one bit on this question, what would you say to politicians in office today who would say that the comparison between the challenge or the threat of Islamic fundamentalism and communist ideology is not very helpful because it construes a sort of a siege mentality? It could lead to a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, to use the cliche of us inviting more alienation and therefore more problems.
Yeah, so this is the big dilemma. If you put it out on the table and debate it, do you cause more trouble than if you simply say, okay, we're just going to leave it to the side? My view is you're always better to be open about these things. And it's a debate that goes on within Islam. That's the fault, is to believe that this is a debate that people have within the West, but they're not having it in Muslim countries. All over the Middle East they're having it. With varying degrees of openness, I agree. But, I didn't, look, when I look at the Middle East today, and I see the activities of the Islamic Republic of Iran, I think that is a destabilizing force all over the Middle East. Now, is that destabilizing force linked to the ideology? I think it makes no sense at all to pretend it isn't, because it obviously is. So I think, you know, but I agree with you, it's a big question. My point is, let's debate it honestly and flush it all out, because I think otherwise you're left in a situation where you're going to end up by default with a policy you haven't really strategically decided, you've just kind of tumbled into, which is always a dangerous thing to do.
Thank you. Let's try to bring in some of the audience. Please introduce yourself and wait for the microphone.
It's William Petty, former ambassador to Afghanistan and Iraq. Good to see you, Prime Minister.
Good to see you.
I accept your thesis that radical Islamism is a fundamental first-order threat akin to revolutionary communism. My question relates to the specifics of Afghanistan. If that is the case, do we look at the Taliban as part of that global revolutionary Islam, or do we accept a nuance that they might be a nationalist version of it and don't quite have the global ambitions that Daesh or Al-Qaeda or other groups would have? And if we can live with that nationalist version of it, what do you think about engagement with the Taliban? Going back to your point about what's our strategy, what are our strategic objectives? And it strikes to me the ones in Afghanistan are, we want to avoid a humanitarian crisis that leads to a refugee crisis, that leads to state collapse, that leads to the sort of failed state in which people who have ambitions beyond their borders threaten others, regionally and internationally. Do we try a policy of engagement with them to avoid those consequences, because they will happen if they don't? So it reminds me of the revolutionary communist analogy. Where would we be if we'd engaged with Castro and Cuba as a unique country rather than as part of global communism? Is Afghanistan a similar analogy?
Yeah, or you could look at Tito, I guess, in Yugoslavia in a way. So I distinguish between the strategy and the tactics. Tactically, you may well have to engage, because that's the reality you're faced with, although you should engage on very clear terms and with some leverage to hold them to account. But I think we've got to be very clear that the ideology they subscribe to is still their ideology. And therefore, and it's an ideology that the people have not chosen to live by. So I'm not, I think in realpolitik, there are going to be a lot of situations, and this is one of them, in which you have to work out what the best way to proceed is for the people in Afghanistan, you know, and for ourselves and our own security. And you know, I don't rule out at all engagement with the Taliban. I'm in favor of engaging with people. I'm just always in favor of engaging from a position of clarity and strength. And I think that, you know, that's where we need to be. But I think one of the risks of this is that we've always got to be mindful of the fact that sometimes we think these groups are opposed to each other, and sometimes they are, but at a certain point they come together and are ideologically coherent. And that's why, you know, we always thought in Iraq it would be impossible for the Iranians to coordinate with Al-Qaeda, but in the end it wasn't when they needed to. And we should never forget that this ideology in the end is fundamentally hostile to our way of life. So my answer is yes, but with care.
And as if by magic, we've got Sir John Jenkins, who is another old hand in the Middle East, who actually wrote recently poo-pooing the idea of the reformist Taliban versus the hardline Taliban in terms of future engagement. Sir John.
Thanks, Jonathan. I won't argue with William on this matter. I'm a former British diplomat, ambassador to various countries, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, other places where certain experiments were tried. The question I wanted to ask, and I thought your speech was great, by the way, relates to domestic politics and what we do about this. Because the issue identified is an issue that isn't just confined to this country. You see it in France, you see it in Germany, you see it in the Netherlands, you see it in Scandinavia and so forth. It's wide. This challenge to what briefly one might call the contemporary liberal state order. I mean, you know, there are complications of that term, but I mean, basically that. And we debated this a lot at the time when I was writing the Muslim Brotherhood Review about what exactly domestic policy, how domestic policy should reflect the understanding of this challenge. And there was a lot of talk about British values. This is something, of course, that has come through into Prevent. The Prevent strategy talks about defending British values. I remember saying to David Cameron at the time, I don't like this term because values change. When you consider values, you can think about values, the things we believed 30 years ago, not necessarily the things we believe today. But I said there's at least one country, and maybe two in Europe, who have dealt with this in a different way, and those two countries are Germany and Austria. And they've dealt with it because they wrote constitutions, post-war constitutions, the German Grundgesetz, which was written by a panel of German jurists just after the war, actually says at the beginning, it says, we believe in certain fundamental and universal rights. It's a Kantian constitution. And it specifies what those rights are. It then set up a domestic intelligence agency, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, which is the federal agency for the protection of the Constitution, which publishes its annual report and will say that Islamisms of various sorts are enemies of the Constitution. This is a term they use. They are Verfassungsfeinde or Verfassungsfeindlich. For various reasons, that hasn't been possible in this country. And I understand that. I mean, there is a constitution in this country, but it's a constitution that goes back to the 17th century and it consists of various laws. But it does mean that we are disabled, it seems to me, when we want to talk about the threat that ideologies of this sort pose. Because essentially these ideologies are what we would have called at one point seditious, although I don't think the Sedition Act has been used since 1905. You can do this in Germany because you have the constitution and it says what it is to be a member of this political community. We do not have this here. What do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier to specify when you have a constitution that's written. On the other hand, I would say that most people would accept in the UK that even if not written in a constitution, there are certain conventional rights that we take for granted that form the fundamental basis of our society. And Islamism is inconsistent with that. I think the limiting political factor here and in America is that parts of the right have become isolationist and potentially anti-Islam, and parts of the left regard criticism of Islamism as Islamophobic. And what that does is one of my theories of modern Western politics is the absence of a strong centre is creating a situation in which short-term politics within the mainstream political parties really dominates thinking and pulls policy in bad directions, which is why this ending the forever wars was both a theme of certain Democrats and certain Republicans. So I think it just needs, one of the reasons I did this today, it's not that you don't get a huge amount of blowback about it, because you do whenever you say these things, but it's a lot easier to put it on the table and then discuss it and force people to confront the fact that Islam and Islamism are two separate things. And this is very, very necessary, because otherwise I think Western politics will get bitterly divided between the left, the parts of which consciously or unconsciously are now actually in alliance with Islamism, and parts of the right who want to take Islamism as meaning this is Islam, and therefore policies that are anti-Muslim are policies that are justified. And that space in the middle, which is where I think we should occupy, is not articulated. So this is what I think we've got to do. And even if we don't have a written constitution, we can still articulate that case very strongly as to why the values that I'm talking about are actually the basis of our societies. But it's a lot easier if you've got a politics that isn't so partisan and divided, that at least this notion is held in common.
The gentleman in the front, but let's make it very quick.
Yes,
the
yeah.
questions, please.
My name is Roy Yacovi. I'm an analyst in Afghanistan. On the 7th of October 2001, I was a child refugee working at a construction site in Iran, as it happens on the birthplace of Ayatollah Rafsanjani. And I heard a tractor driver stand by and say, "Afghan boy, the Americans have just attacked Afghanistan." And I fell onto my knees, being a tortured 12-year-old fleeing Afghanistan. Ever since then, I'd never imagined that one day I'd be, ended up here. I thought I'd go back to my village. Ever since then, I've watched the jubilation and tragedy of the Afghan people and lost friends and relatives there. But over the past week, what I've noticed is our understanding of Afghanistan is very superficial. We don't understand the deeply blooded complexities of Afghanistan as a country, its divided society, historically, culturally, linguistically. But we also don't have a very good understanding of the Taliban itself. We don't understand the constituent part of the Taliban. But we're already beginning to see signs of fracture within the group. And the regional players going to play different parts in different ways. Afghanistan is going to remain both, political, humanitarian and security threat to the West. What are we going to do about it? We've lost the cohesion to deal with it, and are we ready for the very potentially far deadlier conflict that's going to, await the Afghan people with all different actors involved?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I mean, look, I think this is why I think at the very least what we should do, I suggested that we, the leading powers should hold a conference at which you decide at least on an agreed approach. Because obviously we've lost our position there. And I completely agree with you, by the way, that some of these, and I've been guilty of this myself, I mean, it's possible to have a far too simplistic understanding of the country, its people, the different elements, the different tribes and so on. But I think, one of the reasons why I think it's important that we take a long-term strategy and are prepared to hold to it over time is because it will take a long time. But, the fact is, if you go back half a century, Afghanistan had a chance to develop as a very decent country. And one of the things when you go back and you look at the pictures of Afghanistan in the 1960s, you understand that it had every possibility of developing in a good way. Now, we know all the reasons why that didn't happen. But it can be rebuilt over time. And, I was in the Balkans recently, and it was very interesting just to reflect on that, because sometimes people say, well, as opposed to the intervention in Kosovo, Afghanistan failed, but Kosovo succeeded. But if you look even at the Balkans today, there are still massive tensions. There are still a lot of problems. I think it's going to take quite a long time to overcome those problems, but the framework that's been established is one that is allowing those countries to develop. So you go to Serbia or Albania today, and they're a world away from where they were. Now, does that mean the Balkans has resolved all its problems? Absolutely not. But the absence of terrorism and the absence of a fundamental security threat allowed, however imperfectly, those countries to make progress. And the question, therefore, for us is, how do we engage now in circumstances where we sent a pretty clear signal that the military engagement is not something we're prepared to do? And yet, if there isn't at least some way of governing the security of the space, it's very hard for countries to make progress. And I see this all over Africa today. This is why I get so worried about the situation now in the Sahel and countries like Mozambique. I mean, these are countries that have now got a serious problem because they can't, people say, well, the answer, for example, in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique is to do development and reduction of poverty. And I say, that's fine. But if you can't govern the security space, how can people develop? Because you build a road and the next day someone's blowing it up. So this is why, I mean, I think you're right. We do have to to regroup and reflect and then find a way forward. I think what is troubling me at the moment is I get the sense with a lot of Western politicians right now, they just want to say, well, look, okay, this has not been good, but let's just move on. There's COVID, there's climate change, there's China. You know, someone said to me the other day, well, but we should be concentrating on China. I said, I'm afraid in politics, you've got to concentrate on more than one thing at a time. I mean, you don't choose your agenda. I would say the agenda is chosen. How you respond to it is your choice. But you can't say, well, let's ignore that one because we've got to deal. I mean, you might as well say, let's deal with COVID, not climate change. No one says that. They understand you've got to deal with both of those things. And yes, I agree. The rise of China poses a big challenge to the West, but so does this. And, you know, we've got to, at least if we're going to decide a policy, let us decide it and not, as I say, fall into it.
Let me move to some of the questions from the people online who've been waiting very patiently, and then I'll bring it back to the audience here. There's a cheeky question from Anton Gash, who was a British defense attaché in many Southeast Asian countries. Cheeky in a way, as you will see, but it'd be worthwhile putting it to you, which is, let's assume that Tony Blair remained in power for a record-breaking period until today and was still our Prime Minister today. How would our Afghanistan policy would have looked like?
Well, I think and hope that we would have had a relationship with the United States that would have allowed us to be part of this decision-making process. And, you know, for all the faults of the time I was in office, my relationship, first of all, with President Clinton, then with President Bush, those were strong relationships that meant there was a constant interaction between us as individuals and our systems. Now, I'm not in a position to criticize the existing government because I don't know what's been going on behind the scenes, and always a lot goes on behind the scenes. But I would have hoped that I would have argued, I mean, as I said in the essay that I wrote, I think we didn't need to be in this position. And if you go back to 2019, the challenges were very evident. But we had a sustainable situation, in my view, not an unsustainable one. So I would have tried to argue that case. I would have done a few other things as well, by the way, but on the domestic
including
front,
a Brexit referendum?
Not including a Brexit referendum.
Okay, which quite neatly leads us to slightly broader perspectives of the UK today, 20 years after 9/11. There's a question online from Craig Sutherland. How would you assess the UK-US special relationship today? Where do you think we are? And I will match it with Tessa Siskovic, Dr. Siskovic here in the front, who is a journalist and also curates the Kreisky Forum, another great Prime Minister, the Austrian Prime Minister. Tessa, would you like to put your question as well on the European angle?
Yeah, as we're talking about the special relationship, and you touched upon it in your remarks before also, I was wondering on what level you would like to see Britain engage with the European partners in the future now, because obviously through Brexit it's more complicated with EU institutions, but maybe also slightly easier bilaterally with France on military issues, or Germany on secret service cooperation, these kind of things. Could you be elaborate on this a little bit? Thank you.
So the US and the European pillars.
I mean, first of all, let me answer by starting with a political principle I believe is really important to articulate. These relationships are like personal relationships. In other words, you know that your friends are the people that are there when times are difficult. you know, the friendship is forged over a long period of time, and it's based on a trust that you're going to stand together. And that was why after 9/11 I said that the UK and the US should stand shoulder to shoulder. I believed it was really important post 9/11 that America did not feel alone, that it felt that it had allies. And in the same way, even in a completely different context, I've always thought with Europe, Europe can be extremely difficult for Britain to operate in. The European Union was very frustrating for the British Prime Minister, for any British Prime Minister, because of the different culture of the system, the way the Commission would operate from time to time. Your European allies would be doing things you didn't like, with the French-German relationship to navigate. But my point was always, you have to put up with all of that if the relationship matters. And so, in the end, neither with the US relationship nor with the European one, you don't, if you think it's going to be easy to have that alliance, forget it, it isn't. Being an ally of America, a strong ally, is very difficult, because a lot of your own people want to see you, tell them to get lost, you'll find your own way. And yet, if you do distance yourself from America, you find it's a long way back. Now, I personally believe that we should have, over these last, more than a decade, been strong with America and kept strong with it all the way through. Even when it's President Trump, you may disagree with his politics, you may disagree with his policy. If the relationship matters, you've got to really spend time, and you've got to spend political capital on it, whether you like it or not. Same with Europe, which is why I think now, with Europe, right, if I was back in office today, I would realize you've got to repair this relationship with Europe, because you can change your political relationship, but you can't change your geography, or your history, or your values, or your interests. And those are all aligned with Europe. So, I think European defense, within the context of NATO, you don't want to do it aimed at NATO, but I think a serious discussion between Britain and its European neighbours as to what we now do in circumstances where I think it is being signalled across the spectrum of American politics that for the foreseeable future they're going to look after their own interests, but in a quite narrowly defined way. Britain's got to decide what it does, because otherwise that relationship with America is not quite the same, and then we're out of Europe and we don't have a relationship there, and that's not a good position for us to be in as a country. So my view is that now is a moment to reach out, and you'll have new leadership in Germany. Go through the French election. Let's assume for the moment that President Macron is re-elected there. That's going to be an opportunity to rebuild some relationships in Europe around something that's a big strategic interest of ours, and we should have the political capacity and imagination to seize that opportunity.
Would you want to do it bilaterally or multilaterally? Because there is on offer, of course, what you have started in a big way, the relationship with France on security questions. There is a very thick relationship with Germany. You could argue there's a number of other countries, but not with the European Union as a whole. Or do you want to go into the European Union and then all the theological arguments about NATO, EU, etc., which you are very familiar with?
Yeah, that's a good point, but then you've got to navigate it with care. But I think you can navigate it with care. I mean, you may start with the bilateral relationship with France, for example, and build out from there. And this is something where you need those who are expert both in the military and security field to advise you and to set out a plan. But if you just take the Sahel, which my institute works in and which I'm become increasingly obsessed by over these last years, because I think it does represent a future security threat for Europe, including the UK. We don't at the moment have the capacity to help those countries govern their space or get on their feet. And France has been left with its mission there. but I think they are now going to withdraw from that, or at least cut it back substantially. And you know, Afghanistan doesn't make it any easier for President Macron to hold there. So are we just going to let this situation fester until finally we get waves of extremism and migration coming from there, or are we going to try and deal with it? You know, I think building the capacity in cooperation, you know, you're not going to end up with some European army, but in cooperation, countries working together, making sure that they pool their assets effectively. This seems to be, I would take a long, hard look at that at least.
Okay. I think we've got time for two questions from the online. The first one is from Sahar Walker, an old Middle Eastern hand, again, who's asking, I think, the question that preoccupies you, I know, a lot. How can politicians answer your call of sitting seriously and discussing these security challenges when it's 24/7 TV media, when you're constantly under the pressure of social media, when you're constantly forced into making statements about, I don't know, a car crash on the M40, and how are you able to gather your thoughts, lock yourself up, and come up with the intellectual product that you were calling for?
So I think there is a paradox in modern politics, which is that the public, at one and the same time, they're consumers of social media, and social media drives a lot of the political discourse. But at the same time as all of that is happening, they're also very distrustful of it and actually want their leaders to be able to stand out against it. So, you know, I think that people know that you do need to take long-term, clear strategic decisions. The loudest voices often mitigate against that. But I think the public, in the end, would prefer leadership. That's my, maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I think. In any event, it's worth offering it. And, you know, it comes back to what I often say about the centre ground of politics. You know, a lot of people say the centre ground of politics has disappeared in recent years. And I always say you've got to work out whether this is a supply problem or a demand problem. And my view is it's essentially a supply problem. It's that political parties, partly through social media, have become much more shrill and partisan, but actually the public's never much shifted. And, you know, if a strong centre-left, centre-right alternative is on offer, I think people will mostly back it. So I think the best thing for politicians to realise is that in the end, you know, the public will respond to leadership, because this paradoxical attitude towards media, social media, the pressure of events, they kind of both participate in it, but also distrust it. And it's the distrusting part of it you need to appeal to.
And I think the final question is an introspective one, which you must have had about 1,000 times. It comes from Gideon Coolin, and it is, what is the single event or action that you have taken during your premiership of which you're most proud of?
Which I'm most proud of? It's always difficult to answer that, because you could take a particular event like the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, or you could take a policy over time like school reform. I would say that the thing that I am most proud of, and I sometimes say that one of the ironies of politics is that you begin at your most popular and least capable, and you end at your least popular and most capable. And I think by the end of my time, I was taking decisions pretty much with the short-term politics taken out of it and realizing you had to do things for the long term. So in foreign policy, by the end, I was very clear. You keep the relationship with America strong. You are their strongest ally. You're at the center of Europe, and whatever the difficulties and strains, you've got to keep there. And you build through the International Development Department and our budget for overseas aid, you build an extraordinary soft power component to how Britain presents itself. And when we won that Olympic bid in 2005 to bring the Olympics to the UK, I took that maybe wrongly, but I took that as some endorsement of the fact that Britain really counted.
Thank you. That was really very interesting. You referred a number of times, and I failed to do so, so I'll do it now, to your institute, the Institute for Global Change, and do its enormously good output. I'm glad to see some people from the Institute here. I would recommend to all those who read the material to look very carefully at the output. I consume it regularly, and I find it extremely enlightening. And on a personal note, I must say, I remember, again, I come back to what I said at the beginning of your speech at the Institute in 1999. Sounds a long time ago, different world. And your commitment to a policy of engagement, including the use of military force as a force for good, as we used to say at that time. And it's sort of the cycle closed. I was just trying to remember this morning, the cycle closed. One of the youngest members of staff that we recruited now is the son of Kosovar refugees who said unashamedly that he owes his existence to you. So in many respects, you know, there is a personal touch to this that touches us. Mr. Blair, thank you very much for your presentation, and thanks to the very large audience for taking part. Thank you.